right, good morning.
Good morning.
So at least a handful of people got their clocks set right this morning, right? Good morning. We're here at Unity of Springfield. This is our New Thought World Religion class, and I am Amy Burnett. This morning we're going to continue our discussion on Living Untethered by Michael Singer. And we're all adjusting to our time change, so hopefully we can still have some really lively discussion. So the next part of Living Untethered that we're discussing today talks about the mind. And so Michael Singer, I just love the way he describes things and the analogies he uses and all of those things. So he talks about our mind that, he points out that scientists aren't able to read your thoughts as hard as everyone's tried, that there's no machine ever made. People have spent money and time trying to figure out how to read thoughts, and yet there's nothing outside of the you, inside of you, that can read your thoughts. And so he says, what if scientists told you, no, your thoughts aren't there. We can't detect them, so they don't exist. He said you'd walk away and laugh because your thoughts are there. You live with them every day. And so I thought that was interesting that how many things in this world have there been that scientists or others have said, well, there's no proof of that. There's no evidence of that. I can't see it on a machine. I can't see inside your brain and see what's going on. So does that even really exist? And so what he's saying is, well, we know it exists, right? He also points out that the mind is not the thoughts. So he says the mind is the field of energy in which the thoughts are capable of existing. And so his description of that is, he says, just as clouds are not the sky, they exist in the sky and are formed out of the substance of the sky. And so thoughts are not the mind, but they exist in the mind and they're formed out of the substance of our mind. And that the outside is being reproduced in our mind, that we're looking at a mental image, and it's not really that different from when you're dreaming. So he says, in the dream state, the images are being created in the mind and you're looking at them. And in the waking state, it's the same, except the mental image is being generated by the senses instead of the mind itself. And so he talks about how we take in information through our senses, and that creates this image of the world around us. And we kind of talked about that last time, that we are then, we are seeing what our human senses can bring in, but that is not necessarily all that there is to see, right? So just like people could say your thoughts don't exist because we can't measure them, there's so many other things that are happening around us that we don't yet understand or know or see fully, because there's been nothing in our human world that can detect all of those things, because we're I don't want to say limited, but in a sense limited by our human senses of what we can create in this image around ourselves.
At least our belief in that.
Say again?
At least our belief in that limitation.
That's true. So LB's saying that it's a belief in that limitation that then creates the limitation, right? Okay. So when consciousness is simply experiencing reality as imaged in the mind, that's what we call being in the present moment. And so he has a really interesting way, or just a way that really made sense about that present moment, that when we're experiencing the present moment, it's that there's no separation between what we are actually imaging in the mind and our consciousness. And so he says you're experiencing what you're meant to experience, the gift of the moment that's being given to you. It comes in and you learn from it simply because you experience it. There are no distractions. There's just total oneness with the moment in front of you. So he talks about seeing a beautiful sunset. And, he says, we say things like, it blew my mind. Like, it was so beautiful, it blew my mind. And so he says, what does that mean, to blow your mind? And he says, for him, it means that there was nothing left in your mind but that image of the sunset. So for that moment, you forgot about the mortgage, you forgot about your relationship problems, you're not worrying about the past, you're not worrying about the present, you just stop in that moment, and the only thing you're experiencing in your consciousness is the beauty of that sunset. And so he says it's coming through your eyes, rendering in your mind, and merging with your entire being. And so those moments when we're just in awe of something that we're experiencing, and he says your entire consciousness becomes centered and focused on the experience you're having instead of being scattered all over the place. And that is why we view it as a spiritual experience. And I just thought that was a really nice way to think about being in the present moment, and that it is sometimes easy to do with things like a beautiful sunset or just something awe-inspiring, but we struggle to do that just with everyday life experiences of being in the moment. Those thoughts and worries and all of those things are in the way and kind of blocking that. And he says when we're in the present moment, we've allowed a merger between the subject and the object, and there's nothing distracting us from what's happening right in front of us. And that this learning through life is true spiritual growth. And so, yeah, Elby.
That just really struck me. Because I think that I've heard a lot of people use that phrase, that it blew my mind. And I never understood, I never could come to a concept of what that meant. And so I've probably used it, but not with grokking, if you know what grokking is. Not with that understanding of what it feels like to incorporate that as a reality. And so I think a lot of people use that term, but they're not awake enough to understand what it means. So to hear him explain that was very enlightening to me. It was profound.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, it blew my mind. It's really, it blew apart all of the distractions of the mind.
Well, and it would take you to the vortex. It would take you into the vortex. It would take you to ecstasy.
Yeah. Clay?
For me, I'm a hippie child from the 70s. And blew my mind refers to an acid trip for me, but it also refers to experiences that some of my friends that got off of drugs and went to transcendental meditation, and they described the same thing. To me, the way he described it is a real moment of conscious contact with your higher power. And that can be achieved. The Indians in the Southwest have been using peyote to do that for a long, long time. So in my mind, unlike a lot of people, the use of hallucinogenics is not that bad in certain contexts if it can actually bring you into a religious experience. It's hard for me to condemn it.
And so he says, he starts talking about the things that do get in our way, that, why is it so hard to then live in that present moment? What is the stuff that gets in between us and that our consciousness and that moment? And so he talks about the birth of the personal mind, and that we learn through life in those moments of pure connection, that is how we're learning, that is our true spiritual growth. Those moments when we have that connection and we have that realization of the oneness, those are the moments that we start to go, oh, wait, that's really good and connected, and it broadens my awareness of what's going on. But he says, he says, just like everything that you learn makes you smarter, every experience you have makes you wiser. And so he starts talking about, he uses this example, and we'll kind of go through. So he says, when there's the presence, so he talks about experiencing like a rattlesnake. And so he says, when the rattlesnake experience comes into your mind, it may not be a comfortable inner experience. Most of us don't see a rattlesnake and hear the rattle of its tail and go, oh, come here, cute little rattlesnake. Most of us have some feelings because we have this experience or this knowledge that a rattlesnake could be dangerous, that the tail rattling is a warning, that we need to pay attention, we need to focus in on what that is, what is happening, so that we don't end up bitten by the rattlesnake or whatever. And so he says that when that comes into your mind, it's not usually a comfortable inner experience, and it feels far different from our experience of a butterfly. So if we think about a butterfly, and if a butterfly came and landed on our arm, most would see that as a beautiful experience or a comforting, comfortable inner experience. We wouldn't be running away screaming from a butterfly. But he says both are equally important, because there are no problems, there's just learning experiences. And so no matter what happens, you're becoming greater from the experience. And he says, some colors we might perceive as soothing, others as harsh, but in reality, colors, rattlesnakes, butterflies, they're not good or bad. They're just different vibrational rates of the electromagnetic spectrum. And you can learn how to be comfortable with different vibrations. Yeah.
I was just going to mention that too. The rattlesnake could also be the ego going, I'm going to die. If you experience this rattlesnake too intimately, and that, sometimes that uncomfortableness means you're making progress. You're really noticing.
Yeah. And so when he's saying like it's not good or bad, it's just a different vibrational rate of the electromagnetic spectrum. Also the rattlesnakes have been around for a long time. Rattlesnakes, bears, all of these things that might be perceived as those danger warning experiences. And yet, not every person that experiences a rattlesnake gets bitten and dies, right? But there's some like internal thing that we're holding on to. And he talks about the concept of samskaras a lot, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. Things that we're kind of like carrying around, like those internal beliefs about something that may come from an experience, but it may come from other people's experience, and we've just heard about it, but we then internalize it, and we're kind of carrying that around as something. And then I can't remember if it's in here, but he talks about, because that is energy, that as it's coming up, if we continue to resist and push down, then we just create this circle of that thing coming up and being pushed down, and it could potentially become a bigger and bigger force in our life because we are keeping that energy from flowing back out of us.
Don't you think too that it can be, because I think we have a global consciousness as humanity too, and so experiences from past generations are still with us, even though maybe we have personally, or a family member has never experienced a snake.
Sure. I think there's things, like as you were saying that, one of the things that came to my mind is like, I didn't live through the Depression, but my grandparents did. especially my great-grandmother. And so some of the things that she did in response to that, the way she saved, we used to joke, like she had bread sacks full of bread sacks because she didn't throw anything useful away. My grandfather was the same, like his garage and shop was just full of all of these things because he, he would say, he would never throw anything away. He would take it apart and have pieces and parts separated out because he never knew when he would need something. So I never experienced that need of, or being in such need of things, items that you had to scrimp and save every little thing. My life was not that. But in response to being around that and hearing some of those messages, like I will find myself being like, oh, that's a really sturdy box. I don't know if I can throw that box away. Or like, oh, this bag, I can probably, if I saved this, I would find a use for it at some point. And so there's times when I catch myself with those things and I think, where is this coming from? Why am I feeling like I can't release this item back out into the world? And it partly comes from that, even though I never experienced that lack experience of the depression, those messages, like they came in, they're still there a little bit. Yeah, Dee.
Well, my parents lived through the Depression, and I truly believe that is what started my adult life with a lack consciousness, because it all rolls downhill. And even though they may not say, well, I have to keep this, Mother's garage looked like she thought she might need something.
Sure. And like you said, in the global consciousness, there's things that we just do on a daily basis, and we don't even think about it. But if you really sit and start examining, where does that come from? And it may be a practice that originated 100 years ago because of something that was going on then, but it's just evolved into, well, this is just how we do things now, or how we think about things now. And it's not until you really sit and examine that you realize it's not the truth of today, or the truth of this moment, that it's one of those things that's kind of blocking. So he says you can learn to be comfortable with different vibrations. And that makes me think about, like I said, not everyone who experiences a rattlesnake gets bitten and died. And have you ever been around people, or maybe you are one of the people that just stays very calm in the face of even things that other people would find very dangerous? Or maybe you are the person, or you've been around the person that sees the rattlesnake and just pauses and allows the rattlesnake to be, and allows it to go along its merry way, and there's no elevation in blood pressure, there's no spike in the pulse, there's nothing, because they're just like, oh, there's a rattlesnake, and rattlesnakes do what rattlesnakes do, and they go on. I'm not that person with rattlesnakes, I'll say that. But yeah, LB.
Well, my girlfriend's mother was bit by a rattlesnake, and the only thing that happened was a piece of, and she went to the hospital, and their anti-venom stuff had expired like 7 years before. So they air vac her to Wichita, and they put her in an air tank. She had one thing that turned black and fell off on her hand. That was it. So they're not that bad. Second, there was a book that was circulating probably in the 50s, because I think it was translated into French in the 50s by a New Thought lady, called Kinship with All Life. And in that book, Alan Boone learns to communicate with animals, and he meets this lady who is a rattlesnake tamer. And because he had learned that communication, he went in the room with the rattlesnakes and interacted with them. So having read that and knowing that rattlesnakes react to our energy, they sense our fear and it elicits fear in them. Sometimes you can change your thinking by knowledge.
Yes.
And so, that's one of the things that about rattlesnakes particularly, but I actually love snakes.
And that's what he says. So he says, even if you're having those feelings, like you can learn to get comfortable with the different vibrations. And even if you are a person that your blood pressure spikes and you get a little nervous, with knowledge, with thinking about it in terms of energy, he says the reality is a rattlesnake is not going to stay there rattling your whole life. Like it's a moment in time, and it's not. It's going to come, it's going to go, and when it goes, its uncomfortable vibrations will go with it. So, and I think we've talked about that a lot in other topics, that when we can pause and realize that, yes, like this moment is not the rest of my life. Mary Morrissey says something in Prosperity Plus that always strikes me. She says, really bad chapter, not your whole book. If we can come to that realization that these uncomfortable vibrations are just that. It's a moment of uncomfortable vibration, and if we can recognize that it can go, and then something else will happen, and then we will have a growth experience from it, then it changes the perspective of what that rattlesnake in our life is. So he says, you're simply in there experiencing creation as it comes and passes through you. And the problem is that sometimes we don't allow it to pass through us. And that's what I was talking about with those samskaras and things, that we don't allow it to pass through us because we get so wrapped up in the uncomfortable vibration. And sometimes our avoidance of that uncomfortable vibration actually causes it to stay with us longer because we don't allow it to pass through. And, he says we're really good at feeling things come up and resisting and like pushing them back down and pushing them back down and pushing them back down, and then wondering, why do I keep experiencing this? Why does this have to keep coming up? And it's because we don't allow the energy to do what the energy wants to do, which is continue flowing through.
Feel it.
Yeah. And so he talks about, again, his imagery, which anyone who knows me knows that I love imagery and the good analogies. Those are the things that are going to stick with me the longest. And so he talks about when plasma screens first came out. And do you guys remember that they had this thing, they talked about after images, and the way that the screens were manufactured and the way that they worked, that if you paused an image too long on the screen, it would actually burn that image into the screen and it wouldn't go away. And so he says that is, when you went to the next show or when you unpause, that faint image was behind on these screens and then you couldn't ever get rid of it. And so he says that's what's happening with the butterfly and the rattlesnake. You can't see what's clearly going on in front of you because you have all these other images in the screen of your mind that are kind of burned in there, and they're not letting you see clearly. So he says, you've messed up your screen. You didn't mean to do it, but you did it. And it seemed really innocent to push those experiences aside when you didn't find them pleasant. But where do you think they went when you resisted them? They just got stored as a lasting impression in your mind. They just become an after image. Paul, did you have something? Oh, I thought you looked like you were going to.
I actually didn't have anything
to
say, but since you called on me, I'm going to go ahead and tell you a story. Several years ago, it's probably been about 17 years ago, I decided to go hiking for about a 3-day excursion into the Gila Wilderness, and that's in southern New Mexico. And so I had my backpack all filled, and it was real heavy, and I'm just real happy that I'm going to be out in the wilderness for a few days. And about 2 hours into the trip, I go to step over a log, and there is the largest rattlesnake I've ever seen in my life. And I'm assuming it may have been a mother, sitting on her den of babies. But this thing was 4 to 5 times larger than any other snake I've ever seen. I mean, its neck was about as big around as my arm. And that rattle sounded like a freight train. And I do have to say that my plasma screen did freeze right there.
Yeah. And so he talks about
I had basically the same thing when I was a kid.
Hold it up to your mouth.
Where am I at?
Hold the microphone up to your mouth.
Okay. When I was a kid, I played with snakes, had a friend, had a pet snake, and old Ben, I carried him around my waist and everything. I was in my 20s, and I was out in the woods, and it was a creek with a little bit of a high bank.
Yeah, you'll have to hold it up.
A little bit of a high bank, and so I leaned over, put my hand on a tree to look over that, and there was a black snake in the tree, and like you do when you lean over, I couldn't get back. And the snake crawled down my wrist, around my wrist, and back out the tree. I am petrified of snakes. Absolutely. And there's a plain old black snake. But in my mind, I can't stand snakes.
right. In that moment, yeah. And so he talks about some of these images that we burn into our mind, because of that, we start to create preferences that our human mind wants to create good and bad from things. And so we start to create preferences. And of course, most of us, our preferences, we want to feel the good things and not so much the bad things, right? What we have identified as good and bad. And so when we've burned that image of good and bad into our mind, then we start evaluating all of life's experiences through that lens of what we see as good or bad. And so he says, once you've created preferences, they start to dominate your entire experience of life. And so he says, instead of paying attention, you're getting so uptight about wanting butterflies and not wanting rattlesnakes. I only want to experience butterflies. I want all the butterflies, none of the snakes. And so he says that's what creates this where you're losing your centered awareness. So when the world around you comes in and hits or activates your stored patterns, you can't really observe reality objectively because you've got all of these burned images of what it is to be good and bad and whether it's a rattlesnake or a butterfly coming at you. Yeah, John.
I was just going to say in Carlos Castellanos, the Don Juan character, that was one of the things that he always talked about was that, that the reality that it could be very fearful and all these other things, but if you didn't sit with it, you're going to miss so much, and you weren't really seeing what is. And the other part is that when you talk about just practicing non-judgmental stance to balance off those preferences.
Yeah, and so then he talks about that becomes like the psyche, the human psyche, that we build that inside our mind. And so then we start to internalize things like, I'm the person who doesn't like rattlesnakes. I am the person who likes butterflies. And so then we start to build a self-concept based on these preferences that we've developed over time. But someone else might not have that. He said they might have a psyche that's built around thunderstorms are bad and dogs are good, or thunderstorms are good and dogs are bad. And I think that you've probably experienced that with people too. Like I have never had an experience with a big dog that made me afraid of larger dogs. Like all the big dogs in my life have been gentle and sweet and all of that. But I have people in my life who had really bad experiences, what they deemed as bad experiences, like getting bitten as a small child by a large dog. And so that is still a trigger moment for them. Like when a big dog, even if it's got the friendliest look on its face and it comes loping around the house, just seeing that large dog brings them into that burned mental image that big dogs are bad, big dogs will bite you. And so all of that stuff comes up with that. And he says that, everyone's had different experiences, so we're all building different personal minds inside of ourselves. And again, We're not doing it purposely most of the time. It's very reactive to things that have experienced. He says it happens quite naturally because you're not ready to openly experience life. So we have all of these experiences before we're fully aware of the connectedness that is inside of us, and before we've maybe done the spiritual work and have the spiritual growth that can get us to a different place. And he says the highest state is to be comfortable learning and growing from life's experiences. But if you're not comfortable with experience, again, you'll start to use your will to resist them. And then we've just once again created that cycle. And he says if events are coming in and they're meant to be experienced by you, if you have trouble experiencing them, that's the whole purpose of learning to accept. So, and this is where it goes back to, we talked about it in the last class. So he says, what right do you have to either cling to or resist reality? You didn't make reality, and you weren't here for the billions of years that created it. So it goes back to that question. If you remember last time, he says, he said, if someone came up to you and said, so how do you feel about the fact that Saturn has rings? How does that make you feel? Does that impact you? Is that impacting your daily life that Saturn has rings? And he says your answer might be like, I don't know, I've never really thought about it, or that has nothing to do with me, it's none of my business. And he's like, that's the correct response for every bit of reality, is that it's none of your business. What, right? Like, it's just how we're experiencing it. And, he says all of these bits of reality took billions of years to end up in front of you. So it's not, and that goes back to like the world isn't out to get you, or and that it's not, in essence, the whole world has not been created only for you, right? It's we're all having this experience, and there's these things. Reality has been created in the global consciousness and the billions of years of things just existing. And so it's not really about the ego you that's happened, that you're experiencing in this human reality. So he says the real question is not whether or not you like things, it's why are you not okay with them? And so he's like, usually it's because we can't digest them, right? We tend to not like things that we can't understand easily, or that have that discomfort that we might have to look inside to figure out, why am I feeling uncomfortable about this? And so that's why it's hard to let those experiences just pass through without residual disturbance. But he says, but we can learn how to do it. And I think that's what most of us in this room probably have experienced on some level, is we know that we can learn to look at those things differently. And he says, you've learned lots of things. You've learned how to play tennis. You've learned how to ride a bike. You've learned how to drive a car. You've learned how to read. Like we can learn to do lots of things. And you can also learn to experience vibrational energy in a different way. It might just take some time, and you have to stay aware that that's what you need to do, but that we all have that capacity to learn. And he says, you didn't know how to do these things to start with, and some of them were really uncomfortable until you learned how to do them well. Yeah, Clay?
I was just going to comment that you made me mindful of a lot of it has to do with motivation, whether you want to learn something or not. One example is that the only two people, there's 6 people there were before my father passed away, and only my mother and I could sing. But I'm convinced that it was because we wanted to learn to sing. And the other thing is that when I was ready for kindergarten age, there wasn't a kindergarten down in Crane, Missouri, where we lived. So, but my parents would read me the A.A. Milne, Christopher Robin series of books, and I wanted to I didn't want to wait around for them to read them to me. I couldn't wait. I loved them so much. And therefore, I taught myself to read. My parents gave me some rudimentary things, but they were busy. They didn't have time to go out and actively teach me to read. But I wanted to do it so badly that they gave me the ladders, if you will, and I climbed up myself. So a lot of what we perceive as maybe insurmountable is not insurmountable. It's due to a lack of motivation or a lack of trying.
Yeah, a lack of awareness that is possible.
Right.
Yeah. And that makes me think, I saw an interview the other day with Ed Sheeran, and he was saying that so many people come up to him and say, oh, you have natural born talent. Oh, you're so talented. And I wish I could have been born with the talent you were born with. And he says he always laughs and says, I was not born with this. Like, it was a lot of hard work. And he pulled up a video of him singing on camera when he was like 12, and he's not playing his instrument well. His voice is all over the place, and he says, if you listen to that, you would never think this guy's gonna be like a household name in 10, 15 years. But because he was willing to go through that uncomfortable stage of not sounding the greatest, but he had this desire to experience being able to sing and play his instrument and reach people. Now he's experiencing the life of a major star. Like, he is a household name. People are touched by his music and hear his voice and think, oh, he had to have been born with this talent because it's so good. And that just really struck me that he's like, oh, no, let me let you listen to this and see if you still think I was born with natural talent. But it kind of goes to that when we are willing to kind of put our focus and create awareness around what it is that's truly wishing to be experienced through us in this human life, we can make wonderful things happen.
By the same token, a lot of times you see these kids who have this amazing talent who go out and then you never hear about them ever again.
Right, because maybe it wasn't in their awareness that was possible for them. Like, they allowed some of this other junk, these burned images, to get in between them and that desire, yeah. So he says the soul can learn, the you in there, that is the consciousness, can learn to experience this reality differently. And that we have to let go of resistance and not push reality away. And so he talks about that as what, that acceptance is what he sees as non-resistance, that we allow this energy to flow back out instead of continually pushing it down or allowing it to become those burned images.
Does he define reality?
He probably does. He probably does, but I don't think I have it here in my notes how he would define reality. And it may have been in our previous class, I think. So he says it's having the commitment to fully allow reality to pass directly into the highest part of your being. And in the end, all you're surrendering is your resistance to reality. So you learn to let it come in, even if it's not comfortable, and then you allow it to go back out. And he says the same is true with positive experiences. And this was interesting to me too. He says, so when somebody you like comes up to you and says something like, I really like you, you're really attractive, and I enjoy being around you. That is such a nice experience that we start to cling to those beautiful things that were said and to the feeling of that experience. And he said, then they may go back to what they're doing. Like that was a moment for them. They paid you a compliment, but you can't, because that is now in your mind and you can't focus because the impression that you've allowed it to leave is now distracting you, And so he says this is the opposite of be here now, because you're practicing be there then. So he says you just had this beautiful experience and you ruined it. Not intentionally, but you kind of ruined it. He says you ruined it by holding on to it like that butterfly, because now you've created a preference about life experience and that good thing that you perceived as a good thing that you want to be happening. And he says, so now every time the phone rings and it's not the person who said the nice things to you, you're disappointed because you want that thing to happen again. And so you become disappointed about the present moment because it's not that moment. And he said, be aware that you're doing this, that somebody says something nice to you. In a sense, you couldn't handle it. You couldn't just allow it to go and just be a nice experience. You clung to it in your mind. You created an after image. And he says, and you actually messed you up. So
true.
Yeah. And I just thought that was interesting that even the good things, you know, and I think about, it really made me think about in today's world with so much connectedness between people and technology and all the things, like there's times when I feel myself thinking, man, I just wish we could all just experience things without all of this stuff around us. And one of the things I think about is, have you ever had someone like they just really talked up a movie, right? They're like, oh my gosh, you have to watch this movie. It's the best movie ever. It changed my life. This movie is like, you have to watch it. And you get yourself all, oh my gosh, I'm going to watch this movie. It's going to change. It's life changing. This person who I really trust and usually resonate with told me it's a life changing movie. It's going to be a life changing movie. And then you sit down to watch it, and halfway through you're like, this is not changing my life at all. I don't know what they were talking about. I don't know why they think this is such a good movie. Now I don't even know if I can trust any recommendation they ever give me for the rest of my life because this is so off base. Can we resonate with that experience? And it's because we created this image. Before we even experienced the thing, we created this burned image that this movie has to be life-changing because my friend who I trust and love said it's life-changing. And then we don't experience it as it is. We don't allow it to just be the thing that it is and to have whatever our experience with that movie might be, because we are kind of judging it based on someone else's experience. So it could have been a perfectly good movie. Maybe it wouldn't have been life-changing, but it would have been a movie we really enjoyed if we hadn't put all this stuff on it before we ever sat down to watch it. And I think too, you know, like people, now that there's so much social media and like there's videos of everything and pictures of everything. And so, I don't know, have you had the experience where either you're telling a story or someone else is telling a story and it's how you experienced it in your reality, and then someone else is like, let's go to the video footage because I don't think that's exactly how it happened. And it kind of ruins it for you because you're like, oh, well, I really remembered it being differently and I really enjoyed the way that I remembered that event happening or that story happening. And now I've got this video proof in front of me that it didn't exactly happen that way. And so I think, you know, I don't know, there's a beauty in just having the experience you have with something and not always having to like check the tape and check the everyone else's experience, or, you know, like I said, someone being able to post something on social media and then 10 people are like, well, I was there too, and that's not how this happened. And like, we just have some of that it kind of ruins our experience and makes us then experience future reality in a different way.
Yeah, this just reminded me of something. Quite a number of years ago, I was on a business trip in Memphis, and we were walking around downtown near Beale Street. And across the street, there was these two African-American guys, and they yelled out something like, we need to get something to eat. Do you have any money? And, hey, I went over there, opened my wallet, and gave them some money. And so afterwards, we walked on, and I was feeling pretty good. Like, I helped these guys. Well, the person who was with me said, "Are you crazy? These guys could have mugged us. They could have killed us, taken everything we had." It didn't occur to me. They seemed like they needed some help. So, boy, it's where you're at.
Yeah.
It makes all the difference in how you experience something.
Absolutely. And so he says, when you commit to spiritual growth, you work on letting go of the stored blockages from the past and not storing any more from the present. So he said it doesn't mean that the mind's normal memory storage process doesn't take place. You're not willfully forgetting life's experiences. You're just not resisting or clinging to experiences and storing them as those samskaras or those repeating patterns. And they remain a harmless, objective memory that you have. And so this was another example he gave. So he said, let's take an example close to home for some people. So he says, someone may have an ex-husband and they say, I don't want to see him. I don't want to talk about him. I don't even like it when someone says his name. It makes me uncomfortable even years after the divorce. And he says, that's definitely not an objective memory talking, right? That is a samskara. That is that belief, that deep resistance to something that is happening. And he says, so you say you divorced your ex-husband, but you didn't. He's still inside there bothering you. And he's still impacting. He says, like, maybe you don't even go to a party because you think he might be there. Well, that's then impacting your present reality. You've kept these impressions blocked in your mind, and you've created an alternate universe in which you are still dealing with that person all the time because you won't allow them to leave. And so he says, normal memory isn't like this. It's well behaved. Like a computer memory, it doesn't pop up by itself. It doesn't have blocked energies that need to be released. Normal memory is there when you need it, but it doesn't haunt you. I thought that was really good too. So if you're feeling haunted or rattled by those memories, then there's something in there that is that you're resisting, right? Because if we're just experiencing the present moment, not as good or bad, as those memories come up, we'll experience them as a memory and know that we learned or grew from whatever was happening.
That's kind of like Kabbalah tells the story about a rabbi and his student walking along the path, and there's a river and there's an old lady standing there, and she says, "Could you help me across?" Well, the rabbi or the student were not allowed to touch women. And so the rabbi went ahead and picked her up, carried her across.
Yeah, can you hold the microphone? Even
Oh,
online.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good.
The rabbi picked her up and carried her across the river, and as they left, she went one way, they went the other, and after about 3 miles or so, the student says, "I don't understand why you touched and carried that woman." And the rabbi says, "Well, I just carried her across the river. You carried her the last 3 miles."
Nice. Yeah. That's a good one. It makes me think, Sue, of when your talk, the thing that you were carrying on your back, that we're carrying those things around with us.
Yeah.
And so then he talks about the veil of the psyche. And so he says, like, the truth is the whole world is a giant Rorschach test. And so he says the world is a flow of atoms that's unfolding in front of you. It's no more personal than ink blots on a piece of paper. But it's hitting your samskaras, and that stimulates stored mental and emotional reactions. So instead of just experiencing what's passing by outside, you're experiencing all the likes, dislikes, beliefs, and judgments that you've stored about those things on the inside. And that those impressions can be so strong that we actually think that's what is really out there. And he says, just like the ink blots, he's like, the personal mind has taken over your entire life. You're no longer free to enjoy the experiences that are actually happening because you're forced to deal with what your mind says is happening based on all those images in there. And he said it's also why people, just like those Rorschach tests, it depends on what's going on inside and what you've experienced, what you see in those ink blot tests, right? And so 2 or 10 people, 100 people can look at the exact same image and they will say that it is something different because they're pulling on that inner stuff. Yeah, John.
So what that made me think about is that, all reality is energy. It's not really physical, it's all energy. So then, and we're like radio receivers of the vibrations. And all these experiences affect what we're able to tune into or what we're stuck on. So the fluidity of being able to be a scanner, is instead of just only having certain buttons, that those are the only frequencies I ever pay attention to. It's kind of
and so he says that when life seems scary or it seems to always be hitting your weak spots, he says the truth is life is not hitting your weak spots, you're projecting your weak spots onto life. So you're like looking for those things. He said you held on to some positive things from the past, but the problem is they're not happening anymore. So then we create disappointment around the fact that they're not happening anymore. And we try to go back to the same, he says, you go back to the same place where you saw the butterfly and now it's not there. So now it's become a negative loop that it wasn't there and you didn't get to experience it again. And that you've made life into a lose-lose situation. So he says, if anything reminds you of what bothered you before, you lose. And if you're not getting to re-experience what you liked before, you lose. So you're really just in a fight with reality.
Disappointing.
I've been wanting to share this since and it just keeps relating, and so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm in Galveston, Texas, actually on the beach, on my yoga mat, meditating about how to become just the drop in the ocean, to become one with all. And I have this guy come up and said, can I ask what you're doing? Now, I don't make the connection that I am like in the middle of Texas, kind of weird Bible Belt stuff. But anyway, he's an evangelist type person, and he's asking me what I'm doing, and I tell him, because I guess that's an unusual sight in Galveston, Texas. So he asks me what I'm doing, and I tell him the truth, and he goes, well, what does that mean? And we end up having this whole discussion about the Bible, and I just had epiphany about, because I'm like trying to explain to him that love is love, and that Jesus last, because I figured out he was a Jesus guy, that Jesus' last, wish for his disciples was that he become one like he was that they become one like he was one with his Father. And I'm going, so I'm having this discussion, and it just hit me that I was meditating on how to become one with all, and I was like keeping him at a distance because I'm judging him, judging me, and I blew the whole thing. But you know what? I love that you used, we become rattled, because you rattled me this morning in a relationship to the rattlesnake. That was good. And I am like, I was given that experience to actually, and now I can change my whole point of view because, and what's neat is now that I can change my whole point of view, and it changes my existence and my relationship with everybody from that experience even to this one. If that makes any sense.
Yes, it's so nice.
Very cool example.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
And so he says when we're doing all of that, we're in drastic contrast to what Zen calls the beginner's mind. So if we're not expecting anything from a particular situation and then something special happens, that's when it can touch us really deeply. So he said it could be that beautiful sunset, the first unexpected kiss, some other welcome surprise, and that if it touches you so deeply, it's often because you have some scars in your mind that are clouding that event. Like you have a beginner's mind about that experience. And he says, otherwise you would be expecting something based on all your prior experience, and that would interfere with the spontaneity of that event. And that is some of those, thinking about those things that are awe-inspiring. It is often something that we've never experienced before in our life, right? We say, oh my gosh, it was the most beautiful thing. I've never experienced anything like that before. And that's what he's saying, like, that's kind of the point. You have beginner's mind about it, but what we're not realizing is that it was about the awareness in our mind in that moment just as much as it was the moment that was actually happening. Because if we had any prior experience or any of those images burned, it could have been a wholly different thing. Or I don't know if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, like the first time you go to the Grand Canyon and you just stand there, it can be really awe-inspiring. You have like that beginner's mind and feel this connectedness. But then like the 10th time you go to the Grand Canyon, that's when you hear people say, it's just a big hole in the ground, right? Because they've created, like, nothing can be as good in their mind as that first experience. And so even if that was beautiful, like experiencing it over and over again, it never quite takes you back to that first experience. And we've decided that first experience was like the be all end all of that experience. And so then you hear people being really kind of offhand about huge life-changing or awe-inspiring moments, and it just made me think like, okay, like I get that, I've done that, and I've been around other people where I'm having like the beginner's mind experience for something, and they're like, yeah, it is what it is, or I guess, and then you start to feel like, well, why is this hitting me so strongly? And but it could be that there's, obviously, like, they've got other things built up in their mind about that. Trying to be mindful of time here. Let's see.
He had his hand up.
Oh, Clay.
Well, you were talking about whenever you have a totally unexpected epiphany type experience. I remember many years ago I was substitute teaching in one of the low-income schools, and I was having this one kid was just a terror, and I was having a struggle with him, even though I have a lot of classroom management skills. And it was recess time, and all the other kids had taken off out of the room, and there was one child, and bear in mind, this is a second grade class. And I was blown away because she came up to me and she could read my frustration in my face, and she affirmed me. I was blown away by that. She could read my emotion. She said, and her words even were like, "You're doing a really good job. You're really hang in there," basically. I mean, I've hung on to that. That memory has been, that's one that's burned into my screen, and I want it to stay. So it's amazing how something completely out of the blue can hit you like that and just blow your mind.
So he talks about thoughts and dreams also, and that our preferences exist because we stored the experiences from the past. And so sometimes it makes it difficult to live in there. But instead of fixing it, we try to double down and satisfy our preferences. So we have, I want to feel good, and the way to feel good is by getting the house I want, or having the job I want, or being at the weight that I want to be at. Those are the ways that I can feel good, own the car that I've always wanted. And he says those are the attempts we make to compensate for our blockages, and at best, they're short-lived because we're not actually getting rid of any of the blockages. So we can like put a Band-Aid on things, we can dress it up, we can make it look pretty, but if we're not allowing that energy to flow out, it's still blocking something. And so he says the foundational choice we have in life is to either constantly control life to compensate for our blockages, or we can devote our lives to getting rid of those blockages and figuring out what's happening. And that's kind of our path here at Unity that we talk about all the time. And he says, the fact is, if we've stored these samskaras inside, we shouldn't have, but we did. And now we're trying to make the outside world adapt to them. And he talks about, which this so resonated with me, that this is why we sometimes have a hard time making decisions, right? Because we're trying to figure out how each choice is going to make us feel later. So we're trying to put all this stuff. So he says, you know, even things like, where do I want to live? Should I change jobs? We're trying to mentally conceptualize how the proposed action is going to match all the patterns that we have stored inside. And we're trying to play crystal ball with our lives and figure out, you know, well, if I make this decision, how is it going to play out? But we're basing that on everything that's happened before and not the present moment and allowing it to flow forward. And so he says, how about we live in a reality and enjoy the moments that are unfolding in front of us? That's what we can do to be more comfortable and to, you know, have those good feelings that we want. He says, use your mind to be creative, inspiring, and to do great things. Don't let the mind always be thinking about itself and what it wants. Just learn to enjoy life as it is, instead of limiting the ways that you can enjoy life to serve your past impressions. And I think that's where we'll stop for today. Anyway, Michael Singer, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. And it's digestible. Like I said, the way that he breaks things down and the imagery he uses, I know it really resonates with me. And I know that, so we're going to do one more class on this book with me, but then I know Sue has planned for us to do kind of an all congregational series with this sometime in the fall. So we're going to get to dig into it even deeper, and then all of these things that are like percolating in your mind now, we're going to come back to them in the fall after we're done, because this, I still, Untethered Soul, which was the first book with Michael Singer on this topic, like, it is just one of my all-time favorites, and I go back to it often and reread passages and think about those. And again, his imagery really just sticks in my brain. So if you're a person that likes that imagery, I've just given a taste of it in our class. If you read the book or listen to any of his talks, or this fall, it's going to be wonderful. So do we have announcements this morning?
You want to read it maybe?
Sure. And thank you guys for being so interactive. It makes such a good class when we get to share all of our experiences. So the next class on March 19th will be presented by John Brocker on Love is Letting Go of Fear by Gerald Jampolsky. Jampolsky. Carrie Kugler is leading a spirit group at 6:30 from March 23rd through May 25th, and I believe that's on Thursday nights. Yeah. Is that correct? There's going to be meditation and chanting, excerpts from the book, such as Book of Awakening, Cheryl Richardson's Self-Care for the Wisdom, Tara Brock's Radical Compassion and Trusting the Gold, and more. So that's on spiritual practices, and it sounds like it's going to be a fantastic group. We'll once again be holding an indoor yard sale during Planet Unity. The pod is going to be here on March 21st to start holding your donations. Remember that we're not doing clothing or large furniture for this sale. So I think Mary's definition of large furniture is nothing that takes more than one person to carry it around. So like small coffee tables or like chairs, things like that that are very easily moved out of our way. We're just trying to keep from having giant pieces of furniture that people need, you know, it takes 2 or 3 people to move it around. There will be a welcoming ceremony for new members on Sunday, April 2nd. To become a member of the church, you must have attended for at least 6 months and attend the orientation on Sunday, March 26th. And I just want to point out that attendance for 6 months, that's in person or online. That's just interacting with this community here at Unity of Springfield for at least 6 months. Orientation is Sunday, March 26th. Applications are available at the reception desk and need to be returned to Dee by March 19th so that we have you on the list. All right. Thank you all.